All right, so still dealing with the concept of consistency in our parenting class. And just as a reminder, why are we doing this? Why are we raising children as believers, as those who have been saved out of darkness and into light? What is the purpose behind everything that we're doing? Well, the purpose is to glorify and honor God, right? That's why we're doing everything that we're doing. We're glorifying and honoring Him in the parenting process. And so what are we pursuing? We are pursuing faithfulness. That's what we're pursuing. We can sometimes get somewhat results oriented. We can sometimes get emotion and feeling oriented. And so we have to bring ourselves back to the foundation of truth. What are we doing and why are we doing it? We're seeking to glorify God in faithfulness to Him. And how do we know how to be faithful to Him? Well, it is revealed to us in the truth of His Word. So we go to His Word, we go to His all-sufficient Word for everything that we do, including the stewardship that is raising children. So, we're pursuing faithfulness to the glory of God according to His Word. That's what we're doing. So, always remembering that, always coming back to it, always bringing it back to that when we ask the question why, when we ask the question what, when we ask the question how. The Word tells us. So, last week, as we were dealing with consistency, I introduced to you an illustration. And as I said then, all illustrations break down at some point. But we talked about the boundary box, right? We talked about the boundary box. And now that's not a literal box, right? We gave that disclaimer. It's not a box that we put our children in literally. We don't do that. That's not biblical discipline to put your children into a box. So we're not going to do that, but it is a figurative box. A figurative box that represents our expectations as parents for them. It represents the boundaries. This is where they can operate, and this is where they cannot operate. So our child, we want them operating inside of the box, right? That's where we want them. That's where they're free. That's where they're free to operate. That's where they're free to pursue things. That's where they're free to express themselves. Expression without boundaries is not a good thing, contrary to what the world would have you believe. And so we're establishing for them very clear boundaries. Now, how do we do this? We do this through correction, right? We do it through correcting them. And beginning with correction, you have biblical philosophy of discipline, and so we're utilizing spanking from a very young age. When we begin to see that rebellion, we're utilizing spanking in conjunction with correcting with our words, and we're putting those things together for them. And as we do that, we are drawing these lines very clearly for them. Now, we talked last week about the necessity of consistency. Consistency is absolutely necessary. Now, on your sheet, we looked at Colossians 3:20 last week. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing to the Lord. This is pleasing to the Lord. So, in teaching our children what the expectations are, in communicating very clearly where those boundaries are, we are teaching them how to please the Lord. And so just as we're seeking to please the Lord as parents, just as we're seeking to honor the Lord faithfully in our life, we are now teaching them how they can do that as children. Because, as we said, this is an expectation from the Lord for children. God expects children to obey their parents, right? We also see this in other passages. We see this in Ephesians chapter 6. Verse 1, it says there, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. For this is right. So the expectation for children to obey their parents, it is pleasing to the Lord and it is right in the Lord's eyes. We are teaching them an absolute truth standard of moral righteousness. This is a moral requirement for children. Therefore, when they don't obey their parents, when children are disobedient, when they reject the rules, when they try to skirt around the boundaries, when they do things that are deceptive, when they try to manipulate to get their way. These things are sinful, and they're being driven by their sinful heart. So we already talked about the problem of the heart, right? The problem of the heart is that we're born with a sin nature. We are born into a state of depravity. We are born self-seeking and self-gratifying, and children don't have to be taught how to disobey and break boundaries. They already know how to do that. And so we are using correction and biblical discipline to draw these lines very clearly for them. It is a form of communication. We're communicating to our children very clearly, this is where you can operate. When you cross the boundary, when you go outside of the box, right there at that point, that's where we bring correction. And so on and so forth. This is where we bring correction, right here. Not out here somewhere. Not after they're already living in the realm of rebellion. But when they cross the boundary, we're bringing correction. We're doing this consistently because consistency communicates very clearly to them where the boundaries are. We're communicating to them something that is not going to change. This isn't going to change. This is going to stay the same. And if we're parenting in faithfulness, having established these things up front and not acting according to our own whims and our own fleshly desires and our own emotional outburst where it's a constantly changing standard, then we keep the standard the same and we operate with consistency. And so we talked about how these lines have to be established based on sin, right? So we don't allow our children to sin in our household. We've got to establish boundaries that keep them from entering into the realm of sin. And so we're bringing correction when they do that. We talked about safety. We've been given a stewardship in our children. We have experienced a lot more of life than they have. And as those who the Lord has given this stewardship to, we have a responsibility to look over them and watch over them and keep them safe and make sure they're not doing the foolish things like the little one who runs out into the road to play in the street because he thinks it's funny, or whatever else that they want to do that's unsafe. So we're communicating boundaries that deal with sin. We're communicating boundaries that deal with safety. And then we've got the catch-all, and that is the command aspect of it, right? And we see this in Colossians and in Ephesians. When mom and dad tell you something, when they issue a command, what is expected of the child? Well, even if you haven't established that rule yet, when mom and dad issue the command, what do? You listen. You listen and you obey. Children, obey your parents. And so we have to establish for them as well the catch-all. Anytime we tell you yes or no, anytime we tell you don't do that or come here, whatever it may be, we have to establish that we're going to consistently discipline when you disobey commands as well. And so we talked about what happens when we don't bring consistent correction and they get through the box. When they get through the box sometimes, and then maybe after the third time, now we bring correction. Well, that's very confusing, isn't it? That can be very exasperating for a child. We're not communicating clearly to them with our discipline because now they've gotten away with it. They've gotten away with it 3 times, and on the 4th time, we try to bring discipline, and it's just not going to work. It's not going to work very well. And so I talked about how parents who do try to implement biblical discipline but don't see the restraining grace of God in that, when they see that the child is continuing to disobey, when they see that the child is continuing to rebel even when they're trying to do that, that's one of the first things we need to ask. Well, are you doing it consistently? Is there consistency behind how you're implementing biblical discipline. Because if there's not, if 3 out of 4 times we're doing it, well, what's the child going to do? Hey, I'm a gambler. 3 out of 4 times is pretty good odds. So I'm going to keep going, right? I'm going to keep pursuing this thing. So if you look at your sheet there, we talked about these things conceptually last week, but I just want to make sure we answer this clearly. Biblically, why is consistency necessary in discipline? And when I say biblically, think theologically. Think theologically. Why is consistency necessary in discipline? Well, what do we know about our God? Our God is a righteous judge, right? He is a perfect judge. Our God has established an absolute truth standard. He has given us a moral standard that everyone everywhere, regardless of whether they believe in God or not, everyone everywhere is required to submit to. And when we don't obey God's absolute truth standard and recognize God's boundaries of what is right and what is wrong, what does the righteous judge do? He's a perfect judge. He judges all sin perfectly. He is going to judge every single sinful, rebellious thought and deed that a person has. It is all going to be judged. He's not going to overlook it. He's not going to forget about it. He is a perfect and righteous judge. And so consistency for our children, it teaches them there is consequence for every act of sin, and there is an absolute truth standard that our righteous God holds us all accountable to. Now, when we fail to bring consistent consequences for acts of sin, we're also teaching our children something about God then as well. We're teaching our children something about morality and righteousness and judgment. We're teaching them that there's an inconsistent standard. You can see this play out in a child and even an adult's life as they get older. When there's been a lack of discipline, when there's been inconsistent consequences in their life, they begin to think as though they are actually a victim when they do have to experience consequences for their wrong actions. Think about how that works in the home. If you have a husband and a wife who are supposed to be a one flesh union, a team who's unified in this, consistent with one another in this, and yet, let's say the husband doesn't believe in a biblical philosophy of correction, and the wife does. And so the husband lets the children get away with all sorts of things all day long. And then the wife comes in, and the wife tries to apply consistency and biblical discipline. Well, what are the children going to begin to view her as? They're going to begin to think, well, Dad lets us get away with these things, so what you're doing to me, that's wrong. I'm the victim now of something wrong that you're doing. You can see this play out in children's life as they grow up, as they get older. You can see this in the life of adults when they've had inconsistent consequences their whole life, and then all of a sudden they do something and they're met with real consequences, like, say, the police come to knock on their door because they've broken the law. And all of a sudden now the reality is brought home and you're going to be arrested and taken to jail. They don't have a concept for it. They lose it. They can't believe that somebody would actually do this to them. I can't believe that you're bringing this terrible thing into my life. I don't deserve to be treated like this. Because they don't have a concept of consistent consequence. They believe that they're the victims when they're held accountable. We see this all the time in our culture today, don't we? We see the victim mentality. The victim mentality in our culture. When consequences are brought to me, I shouldn't have to be dealing with this. I shouldn't have to have these things happen to me. In fact, you who are bringing the consequence, you're the bad guy. You're doing something bad. Well, we don't want to develop that kind of a mindset in our children. So biblically and theologically, why is consistency necessary in discipline? Because we're teaching them about the nature of God. He's a righteous judge. And we're teaching them about truth. There is an absolute truth standard. We're teaching theological concepts when we discipline correctly. Practically, why is consistency necessary in discipline? We talked about this too. Conceptually last week, we talked about this with our box. When we lack consistency, when 3 times out of 4 they're able to escape the box, and I had one parent make a comment last week after we finished this. He said that the whole time we were talking about this, he couldn't help but think of the first Jurassic Park. If you remember the danger in the first Jurassic Park, they made a big deal about how intelligent the velociraptors were. And the velociraptors were kept in this cage, and at the top of the cage, there's an electric fence all the way around the top of it. And they talked about how they're so intelligent, they'll test different parts of the fence to try to find the area where they can get out. Well, then all of a sudden, the fence lost power. And so what did they do? They tested the fence, they realized where they could get out, and where were they? They were out. They got out, right? They got out. And he told me the whole time we were talking about this, he couldn't help but think children are like velociraptors. That was his illustration, not mine. But I thought it was a pretty good one, because they do test the fence, don't they? They do test the boundaries, and when they can get out, they learn, oh, over here I can get out. Or when mom and dad are distracted, I can get out. Or when it's just mom and not dad, I can get out. Or when they're overwhelmed, I can get out. And so if they've gotten out, even if it's 2 times out of 4, they got out 50% of the time, right? They got to live out here in rebellion land. They got to follow their sinful little heart's desires and get outside of the boundary. That's what they got to do. And so 2 out of 4 is pretty good odds. We'll keep trying. We'll keep going for it. So what do we have to prove to our children? We have to prove to them that every time they cross the boundary, there's going to be correction. There's going to be correction. There's going to be consistent correction. And so practically, why is consistency necessary in discipline? Consistency in discipline communicates very clearly to our children where the boundaries are and that they cannot cross them. It's communication. It communicates to them very clearly where the boundaries are and they cannot cross them. You think about the sinful heart. The sinful heart desires something. And when you're talking about a child's sinful heart that desires something that they know is against the rules, just like our internal desires often lie to us, we have to prove to them that their internal desires are lying to them. And so when they pursue the sin, we don't want them to get away with it. We don't want them to be able to indulge in the sin without consequence, because that's just reinforcing the desire to pursue sin. We want to bring a painful response just enough to communicate to them that that's not good, it's not a pleasurable thing, just enough to communicate that to them so that they understand, when I cross the boundary, when I chase after that sin, I'm not actually going to get what my heart desires. What I'm actually going to get is a consequence that I don't like. And if I don't like it, then I'm not going to keep pursuing it. And if I know it's going to happen every time, because mom and dad are diligent, because mom and dad are paying attention, they're alert, because mom and dad love me enough to do this God's way, if I understand that, then when I begin to pursue it, I'm going to remember, oh no, every time I do this, I get the consequence that I don't like. So I'm just not going to do that anymore. I'm going to operate inside the realm that I've been instructed to operate in. I'm going to operate inside here. Inside of my parents' expectations, inside of the boundaries. Because I know what's going to happen if I don't. And I know that mom and dad are in unison on that. I know that mom supports dad in that, and I know that dad supports mom in that. I know that when one is away, the standard's not going to change. It doesn't get bigger and smaller depending on who I'm around. I know that this is what is expected of me. And so I'm going to operate inside here. Even a child who's unregenerate, a child who is still enslaved to that sinful heart, they can be impacted by consistent discipline. Why? Because even the sinful heart is not going to continue to pursue things that result in negative consequences. It's not giving them what the heart desires, so they're not going to continue to pursue it. So, practically, it works. It works. Why is consistency necessary in discipline? Because it is a means of restraining grace in our children's life that teaches them where they can operate. Teaches them where they can operate. The third thing there, what will be the result when we lack consistency? What will be the result when we lack consistency? Well, first of all, we already talked about this. Biblically, theologically, what will be the result? We're doing our children a disservice when it comes to teaching them about the nature of God and the nature of all things. We're doing them a disservice when trying to teach them about the nature of God and the nature of all things. Also, we're doing them a disservice when it comes to laying the foundation for the gospel in their life. We're doing a disservice when it comes to laying a foundation for the gospel in their life. Why? Because our children have to understand that there is a righteous judge, that there is a moral truth standard, they are held accountable to it, and there are consistent consequences for when they sin, because that communicates to them their need. When they understand that, as they get older, and as they begin to understand their sin problem, and as they begin to understand that they can't follow this standard perfectly, nobody can. What does that then turn their heart toward? It turns their heart toward their need. They need something, right? What do they need? They need the grace of God. That's what they need. They need the good news. They need the good news that rescues them from their inability to be perfectly righteous. The good news is that Jesus Christ came, and although God is a perfect judge, and although there is a consistent consequence for every act of sin, Jesus Christ came and he took our sin upon himself, all those that belong to him. He took our sin upon himself, and he paid the penalty, because there's always a penalty for sin. But he paid the penalty. So, when we don't do this from the start, we're doing a disservice to them in that we're not laying a solid foundation of theological understanding that we can then communicate the gospel to them through. It makes it much harder for them to understand these concepts when we begin talking about it if they've never been disciplined. Likewise, what will also be the result when we lack consistency? Misbehavior. It's very practical. Misbehavior will be the result. Children who don't listen, children who, right here, they do not listen to commands, because there's no consequence when they don't listen, or the consequence is inconsistent. So, you give me a command, the 2-year-old who thinks it's funny to run out in traffic, if you've never introduced consequences to them when you issue a command, well, all of a sudden when it actually does become dangerous, they're not going to take you seriously then. They're just going to keep going. They think it's hilarious that you're chasing after them. So, misbehavior, a lack of following commands, sinful behavior that goes unrestrained, and as a child gets older, this you begin to see this becomes very problematic. The terrible 2s, the terrible 3s, you hear people talking about these terrible times that little children go through. Well, when there's a lack of consistent consequences through those years, you get a terrible 13-year-old, and a terrible 16-year-old, and a terrible 18-year-old. You have to restrain that sinful depravity in their heart. You have to be restraining grace in their life, likewise with safety. We have to be communicating to them that this world is a dangerous place. It's an issue of stewardship, that we're communicating to them this world is a dangerous place. And so the result when we lack consistency in disciplining when they're doing unsafe things is that they're potentially going to be injured, hurt, or even worse. And so the results when we lack consistency, they're not good. They're not good. Now, there's obviously varying degrees to this. And we all parents, can struggle with this, right? In fact, this is one of probably the hardest things about training children is maintaining diligent consistency, right? Maintaining diligent consistency. Because this means that I have to get up off the couch when I don't want to get up off the couch. It means that I have to leave the grocery store when I don't want to leave the grocery store. It means that we have to potentially endure an embarrassing situation at dinner out with the friends when we could just appease and it would go a lot easier. It means that we have to do things that in our flesh we don't feel like doing in the moment. But when we understand how vital it is for their concept of the world and of God and the gospel, and then we understand how vital it is just as a restraining grace in their life because of their sinful behavior, sinful desires, then this is something that we pursue, and we pursue it daily. And when we don't do it well, what does faithfulness look like? When we're not doing it well, what does faithfulness look like? Well, it means recognizing our inconsistency and then saying, okay, I'm a repentant person. I'm repentant. I'm going to turn from areas of unfaithfulness in my own life, and we're going to pursue faithfulness from this point forward. That's what we're going to do. And whatever needs to change according to the truth of God's word, we're going to change, and we're going to grow, and we're going to reform according to what God's word is saying. And that's what pursuing faithfulness looks like, because we're all growing, we're all comprehending new things from God's word, and we want to continue to grow and humble ourselves under the truth of his word as we learn new things about what's faithful and what's not. So hopefully that answered those questions sufficiently for you, but we've got a few minutes, and I just want to open it up for questions. We're going to keep talking about both discipline and counsel over the next few weeks, so this is going to be a continuing topic. But what are questions that may come to your mind? Scott, if y'all could hear Scott was saying, just look at what's going on in Portland, Oregon right now, and in other places where you're seeing violent insurrection. Really is what you're seeing. You're seeing rebellion. You're seeing lawlessness and entitlement, an entitlement mentality, a victim-driven entitlement mentality that refuses any kind of consequence, refuses any kind of absolute truth standard. And when people who are now adults, who have never been taught these things, when they don't get their way, what do? You've got the terrible 25s, terrible 30s, who are acting as though they are 2-year-olds, throwing temper tantrums, except now they're grown adults. And that's very dangerous now, when a grown adult is throwing a temper tantrum like a 2-year-old, because they're not getting what they believe they're entitled to. It's not good for a society. And this is one of the reasons why back at the beginning we talked also about government. And government is a means of restraining the depravity of society. God has ordained that government would be a means of restraining society. It restrains the depravity of human nature. Human nature must be restrained, or else the totally depraved will carry out their depravity to its logical conclusion. And so there has to be consequences on a universal level that everybody understands. You could just as easily take this from the sphere of the family and place it over the sphere of society. You have government agents, right? You have standing armies and law enforcement and judges and those who rule. In some places you have kings and rulers who rule over societies. And for what purpose? It is to give blessing to those who do right and is to bring consequences to those who do evil. Because in this, the depravity of man is restrained. This, like the family, includes those who are both saved and unsaved. And so it restrains the wickedness in the world. And so when the family unit is doing what it's supposed to do, and then the government is doing what it's supposed to do, society in general, even a society that is made up of unsaved people, is benefited by it. So it's a great point, Scott. Gene.
So I have two things. I know you're going to answer them, I think, but having raised children and didn't do it always so well. So the first one is the child's behavior is their own responsibility, but you as a parent have created conditions that make it very difficult for them. Like they haven't had enough sleep. They've been sick. You haven't fed them. Just makes it harder. So that, and the second one is, what if you haven't thought through your boundaries well in some instances, and then you take back what you have said? Like, for instance, the internet. You kind of thought all that was fine, and then you start learning more, and you've had a lot of freedoms, and now you're changing the boundaries. So, speak to those two things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Real briefly, I think there's two things that we can look at there. One is motivation, right? So to kind of answer the first part of it, my motivation, why do we correct and discipline? Why do we do this? Remember, we're always doing this motivated in love. So we love our children. We're desiring to use correction and discipline to communicate something to our children. So it's not because I'm frustrated, angry, or because I'm not getting my way. It's because I love my child and I want to communicate clearly for them. So recognizing that there's going to be seasons and situations where in their flesh, they're struggling more so than they normally would. And I think if I'm motivated by love and I'm in tune to those things, then I'm gonna understand those different struggles that they're having, and I'm gonna deal with the situation appropriately based on that. And if there's any question, I would say pray. Anytime there's any question, just let me set you right here for a minute. I'm going to go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, help me to be motivated rightly. Help me to act with wisdom and discernment according to the truth of your word. Maybe both parents come in together and you talk about it. You go out of earshot of the child, talk about it, and work it out together, and then decide what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. But love motivation is always going to temper those things. And then the second part of that, it sounds like in a situation like that, you've got a little bit older child, right? Where maybe you've done things that you're like, I really shouldn't have done that. We really shouldn't have established this over several years, and now we're going to reel this back in. Well, clear communication. Clear communication. And we're gonna talk about this as we go from discipline to counsel. We are communicating clearly with our children as best as we can. When they're little, they don't understand much, right? They don't understand the philosophical and theological concepts. But as they grow, we're always communicating clearly because discipline is communication, right? And so we want to communicate up front, and when we enact discipline, we also want to communicate after the fact. So we're dealing with heart issues as well. We're dealing with these concepts so that they're actually comprehending the point. And so in that type of a situation, I think first and foremost, sitting a child down, or the children, maybe it's the whole family, has been doing something that you want to reel in. You got to reel it in. So you sit the children down, and in love, you explain to them, hey, look, we were not thinking correctly in this particular area, and we want to confess that to you. We don't believe that this is good for you any longer, and so now we're going to establish a new set of boundaries. And so you explain it to them, and then very clearly you communicate what the boundaries are going to be moving forward. Now, if you've already established this, then that shouldn't be too much of a problem. if this has already been established, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But maybe that's something that we've got to establish now too. That when mom and dad are the authority. When we decide something together, that's rule. That's the rule. And so if that's what we've got to work on establishing, then that's what we work on establishing. But that's part of it. We're going to make mistakes, right? Whether they're kind of long-term mistakes like that, or whether they're mistakes in the moment where maybe we've just disciplined out of wrong motivations and it's become very apparent to our child that was the case. It's good to communicate clearly, and it's good to communicate to them that we're not perfect either. We're held to an absolute truth standard as well. And I want to communicate that to you. And if I've sinned against my child, I want to seek forgiveness in those moments. But that doesn't mean that we're going to just toss all this out just because mom and dad aren't perfect, right? We're seeking faithfulness. We expect them to seek faithfulness. We're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to pursue it and grow in it. Great questions, Gene. We will hit on some of that stuff a little bit more in the future. Let's finish up. I'm out of time. Lord, thank you so much for the truth of your word. Thank you for its sufficient, authoritative revelation of truth that is so practical for all of life. The depths of your word are unsearchable. We are just so blessed to have it as a manual. And Lord, I pray that each and every one of us would seek to glorify you in our lives with the different spheres of responsibility that you've given us. Seek to glorify you according to your sufficient word, daily being conformed by it, daily seeking truth in it. And in this, Lord, we pray that you would use us to your glory. It's in your name that I pray. Amen.